Hi guys, welcome back. Welcome to week 7 and our discussion of state policymaking. This week is going to be a little different from the previous weeks where we have focused mainly on the federal system. So we're going to make a shift and talk about the state system this week. So I hope you're doing well. I hope you're ready and moving forward with the different materials for the week. And we are making our final push towards spring break. And this week you only had to read a couple of readings for me. You had to read chapter 8 from the Howard text, and then you had one online reading from Dolan, and that piece was published in 2013. And then you had, again, 2 matching SCOTUS cases involving domestic partnerships, and then later on involving same-sex marriage. So this is going to be basically our last week, I believe, talking about social issues, and the remainder of the semester we're going to move our attention towards more of the criminal aspect and civil trials in general. So moving forward, when we talk about same-sex marriage, we know that for years it's often been perceived as a states' rights issue, and many same-sex partners had just very much wanted the right to be able to get married, legally married, the same way that straight couples had had the ability to do for generations. But for a while, really the best thing that states were willing to offer these individuals were the idea of domestic partnership. So we're not going to call it marriage, we're going to call it something different, and it's not going to have all the same benefits that legal marriage did have, but it's the best that we're really willing to do for a long time. So by being able to have a domestic partnership, a lot of things that you were missing out on, you couldn't file joint tax returns with your domestic partner, and for medical purposes they still weren't really recognized as family, so your domestic partner couldn't make any sort of decisions on you, like I'm going to pull the plug, that kind of deal. And there really wasn't any sort of legal decision making that for legal purposes that a legal spouse is able to do. So again, the fight is turning towards this recognition of full legal marriages for same-sex couples, and along with that comes all of the full legal rights and privileges and responsibilities that are associated with marriage. And some states jumped on board with this idea very quickly. Massachusetts was actually the very first state to recognize and pass a law stating that same-sex marriage was possible, and they really put this into place after the state Supreme Court ruled that their current marriage ban was unconstitutional. So Massachusetts is the first one, and it takes place in 2003. And other states started to do something similar, but not all the same way that Massachusetts was going. And at the same time, the states were sort of moving towards this more, I guess, progressive stance on same-sex marriage. The federal government was sort of moving in this opposite direction and was taking an anti-same-sex marriage stance, and was really increasing the amount of efforts that it could pass in order to deny same-sex couples the right to marry. So in 2003, the same year that Massachusetts passed, or I guess ruled their marriage ban to be unconstitutional, the House of Representatives introduces the Federal Marriage Act, which was going to be, it was created with the intention of a constitutional amendment being added, which was going to outlaw same-sex marriage completely and totally. So that marriage, the Federal Marriage Amendment didn't pass, but instead what we started seeing was that individual state governments were picking up the slack that the federal government sort of they viewed to be failing on, and the individual states were passing individual constitutional amendments banning the practice of same-sex marriage. And so the federal government wasn't able to do it, but individual states are showing success from their perspective that we're going to pass these constitutional amendments in our own states. And it's really, if you think about it, it's a lot easier to pass one individual state constitutional amendment than it would be to pass a federal one. So of course they're going to have more success from their perspective in denying people the right to get married. So During this time, we're seeing a little bit of progression from the states and then a lot more in a negative direction. But we're also seeing an increase in the amount of domestic partnerships or civil unions that are taking place. And same-sex couples are basically saying, well, if you won't let me get completely, fully, legally married the same way that straight couples are allowed to, I at least can do this in the meanwhile and show that I am committed to my significant other. So in states that are not allowing for marriages, they're basically passing these domestic partnership or civil union laws that are sort of trying to appease same-sex couples and giving them something, but for people who really want to be legally married, this is sort of an insult in a way, and it's not quite the same thing as we discussed before. So we're rolling forward a little bit, and by 2010, we only have at this point 4 states that are legally recognizing marriages, not domestic partnerships, but full-out marriages. And the remainder of the states either have an outright constitutional ban or a statutory ban on same-sex marriage, and they're denying same-sex couples the ability to get married. But just 2 years later, we're really starting to see a very fast tide turn. And it's happening just as quickly as it possibly can in such a short amount of time. So during this time period, President Obama comes out and outright publicly supports same-sex marriage initiatives, and he is fully encouraging for states and the federal government to get on board. And a handful of states at the same time are either legalizing the practice of same-sex marriage by creating a legislative law that's going to legally allow it to happen, or their state Supreme Courts are overruling the marriage bans and finding them unconstitutional, or they're finding the amendments unconstitutional. So, a year later, now we're up to 2013, the Defense of Marriage Act, which we call DOMA, that was passed during the Clinton administration, that's going to be ruled unconstitutional. And now, for the first time, the federal government, not the states at this point, but the federal government is going to recognize same-sex marriages from the states in which they were legally completed in. Right, so if you got married in Massachusetts, remember that was our first state, if you got married in Massachusetts, the federal government is going to legally recognize your marriage. So there's federal recognition at this point, but that doesn't mean that all states have now legalized same-sex marriage. So a couple years later, in 2014 and 2015, a series of state bans are overturned, thus making same-sex marriage available in a lot more states. But the real victory comes in the summer of 2015 when SCOTUS rules that all state bans on same-sex marriage are unconstitutional, and it paves the way for total marriage equality across the country. And this really mandates that now all states have to allow same-sex couples to marry. Not that they're allowed to give them civil unions. They have to let them legally marry in the same way that straight couples are allowed to marry. So they have complete and total marriages and everything that comes along with them, including the right to divorce. So at this time, if you remember, shortly after the summer of 2015, after this ruling came down, just really even a couple weeks afterwards, then the discussion became whether or not states were going to allow same-sex couples to receive marriage licenses. We can't stop you from marrying, but you have to have a legal marriage license, and we can maybe stop you there. Right? And the big news story at that time was the clerk that came from Kentucky, and she decided that she was not going to issue marriage licenses, and a handful of other states jumped on board with this idea, and they said the same thing, and they were going to start shutting down the clerk's office to issue marriage licenses. Well, you can remember that this lady, this clerk from Kentucky, she stated that she wasn't going to do it based on religious reasons. And basically what they did was they placed her in jail, right? If you remember this, she was placed in jail for a handful of days, and basically what they said was that if you're not going to do your job, we're going to imprison you. And local, state, and federal officials, you are representatives of your jurisdiction. You have to do your job, and there should not be any religious exemption because of the separation of church and state. So if you work for a local business, let's say, like one of the biggest things that go along with marriages are flowers, caterers, photographers. If you own a private business doing any of those things, you can deny clients the ability to use your services based on religious preference, and that's fine. If you want to do that, that's fine. You have the legal right to. You might lose business because of your stance, and we've seen that happen too. That's definitely a possibility, but you have the legal right to say, no, I'm not going to be a photographer for your marriage, or for your wedding, rather. It's your choice. However, if you work for the government, it's a little bit different, right? You don't have a choice in the same way that a private individual does. Someone has to do their job and has to issue marriage licenses. So anyway, you remember from the story, Mike Huckabee got this lady out of jail, and it became this whole big thing. But either way, people are now getting the federal and state governments to recognize their marriages, and they're now receiving their marriage licenses, so everything is all good again and the fight is over. But for a while, as you remember, it was all over the news about what this woman was doing and what other states were going to try and do in support of her actions. So really, this is a topic that we sort of have covered all over the news in the last handful of years, so I'm not going to go much further into it, and you guys all have your opinions and your thoughts about it anyway. So this week's readings really are just going to be a continuation of what I'm talking about, and the Dolan piece really is discussing this idea of private business and personal religious freedom, and the Anderson case is going to focus on the earlier part of it, where we talk about domestic partnerships and the now since overturned DOMA case, or DOMA Act. And then finally, in the last case for the week, the Windsor case is going to focus on how DOMA was actually overturned at the federal level, in which the federal government is now going to recognize same-sex marriage in the states where it is already legal. So this week, I want you to spend some time really just discussing and dissecting the legal arguments that came out of these two cases, and the legal arguments that are made in your textbook and in the Dolan piece. And remember, just like we talked about in week 5, this is an issue that still might be a little bit sensitive for some of your classmates. I don't know your particular stances on it, but I respect everybody's opinion, so I want you to do the same. So just be respectful, be mature, have a very fantastic discussion about it all. I think it's a topic that you can really delve into and have some good conversations about, but just do it in a respectful manner. That's all I ask. So the in-class discussion, the discussion boards rather, and that you guys have to do. I've had a lot of success with this in the past, and I've had good conversations, so I'm expecting you guys to provide another good discussion for me this time, and I really would like to see how that's going to translate to an online format, and then how that's going to carry over into your weekly writing assignments. So again, if you have any questions, comments, want to talk about anything with me, I'm available to you, and if not, then I will look forward to the submissions that you're going to provide to me, and I will see you next week when we sort of switch gears and we're talking about our really first criminal court focused lecture for the week. So I will see you all then, and you guys have a good one. Bye.